Yeah, it's interesting, and I think it's particularly interesting if you think about the case of Greece that you mentioned. EU IMF Corporation, for example, there the Europeans had a big role in the IMF, but some critics say not for a better end or better impact, and sometimes accountability and transparency get muddled. So it's an interesting theme in the European Parliament studies that you have a kind of compound governance structure that is doubly removed from democratic legitimacy and accountability and transparency. And, for example, France and Germany playing a strong role in the IMF's deals and conditions on Greece, where even the IMF would have offered more lenient terms. And at the end of the day, who controls the EU's positions in international organizations when those organizations then feed back into European countries' governance policies and so on and so forth. So these are quite complex but also quite pertinent and interesting questions. Thank you so much for all panelists. I think that set up the stage very nicely, the legal, political and economic dimensions. It's now, without any further ado, over to you. Please identify yourself when you ask a question. You don't only have to ask a question, you can make a comment, you can challenge the speakers about any kind of aspect, so please feel free to use the Q&A time now as much and as good as possible. Okay. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, my name is Omer, and I'm a student at Vesalius College. I would like to ask you, with the rise of far right in the EU, hypothetically, what does this mean in case of effective multilateralism? Does it mean that EU is going to have to take more radical stands in the future as a whole?
Okay, thank you. I think we can connect 5 or 6 questions. What?
Hi, I'm Jamal Shaheen. Thank you very much. Lots to think about, but I'm going to ask one question for the moment, and maybe we'll come back to some others later on. You talked a lot. I think this goes to several speakers. I think you talked a lot and about peace and security issues, and I'm wondering also. My area of research is actually much more low politics, so internet governance, telecommunications and cables and things. It can be very high, yes. Well, yeah. And I was just wondering, what did the Lisbon Treaty actually change for EU representation in the ITU? I've read some work from some of the national regulatory authorities that were very concerned that suddenly now the EU would take over the role of representing them in the ITU. And I was just wondering if you had any experience or knew anything about that, with it being one of the UN agencies there.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Thank you. So my name is Aitem. I'm a law student in St. Louis University. And at a certain point, you were talking about one country representing the whole will of the European Union. And I'm going to ask you, doesn't that bring a risk of having a state-centric institution, which, as you said, the UN probably is? And wouldn't it affect the parts who are, let's say, playing or working in the game more than others that will be dominating?
So just to get it right, you're asking whether some member states in the EU might enforce their view on the entire EU. Okay, all right. Thank you. Any further questions? No, then we'll leave you some. Sorry. Okay.
Hello, I'm Bogdan. I'm from the University of Exeter. I'm doing a PhD. I was interested in, because you touched a bit upon CSDP missions, what is, in your opinion, the role of the European Union, and in particular the External Action Service, in post-reconstruction, post-conflict reconstruction projects, stabilization missions? Do you actually think that the UN, in a way, is acting as a springboard setting the scene for later missions such as ULEX in Kosovo and so forth for Afghanistan or Iraq or probably what's going to happen in Syria in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, then we leave it this first round. We might have a second one, depending on the appetite and inquiry from your side. And also, I think I might add one, and that is really could the speakers enlighten the audience with a concrete example where the EU really had an impact on effective multilateralism as you understand it. So, where is the clear example, the poster child of, there you go, the EU made a difference in international fora. Could we go backwards, maybe in reverse order? Any questions you might want to address? I think most of the questions were kind of spread out. Anything you want to pick out, starting with Dirk, then everyone else on that.
Well,
just to remind you, we had the rise of far right,
yes.
The issue of representation in the ITU, the issue of one member state dominating the EU discourse, CSDP missions, and UN acting as a springboard, and then an example where the EU might have been effective in impacting organizations.
Well, the rise of the far right, of course, is a factor that plays a role. I was a few weeks ago in Strasbourg, and there was a discussion on smart borders, and these people are being listened to. It doesn't mean that the position of the EU as such will dramatically change, but some of their aspects will be translated to a certain extent, and I would not say a major extent, in the position of the EU. This is how it works. But I will not ever believe that this will change by 180 degrees, or that this will be the major factor in the way the EU will determine its position. But this is more as an official in Parliament that I'm speaking. I know my colleagues may have other ideas about this. Yeah, the other questions are probably, well, more for them, I would say.
From your studies, maybe, on impact, EU's impact in international organizations, do you feel there is a specific example where we can say, well, yeah, the EU really made a difference?
Well, I think the EU is, in all these organizations, very important, but the way they are talking is another issue. And if you have 4 member states speaking for themselves and then the EU in the same organization, you see that the coordination is extremely important. You often find out that there are some small divergences in views, which complicate the one voice speaking. Yeah, I mean, we looked at 9 organizations. They are so different that it's very difficult to come up with one example.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Jonas.
Yes. Well, as to our impact, I would argue that we have, as the EU, had a real impact on the setting, on the formulation of the Agenda 2030, on the Sustainable Development Goals. I believe that, the obvious one was, of course, Goal 16, which was dear to our hearts, namely good governance, human rights, rule of law. But more important than that is that I would say these aspects of the whole agenda came across thanks very much to our to our one voice. Also, the integrated nature of the agenda, social, economic, and environmental. I think that certainly the EU was one of the actors who stressed that most, or one of those who did it most. And finally, the integrated approach of financing for development with the Agenda 2030, so it didn't end up being 2 different tracks, but one integrated track. Of course, this has to be scientifically studied, but this is our impression. At the same time, it worked to even surprisingly well, the EU coordination, because there was. I think
in the beginning there was a sense, because there had been a pre-phase, which was the open working group, where member states also worked in coalitions with non-member states in formulating, in a way, the first proposal for the goals. And there was perhaps a fear that member states would not line up when it came to the final negotiations. But actually that happened. And I think because everybody, sometimes also some member states who perhaps not are always the most EU enthusiastic ones, realized that in order to promote the national view, it was a good idea to join forces in the European Union. And still, member states also spoke in their national capacity. So there was an EU statement, or there were many statements, but usually there would be one EU statement building on the common position established in Brussels, but sort of finalized on the ground in New York by EU's member states. But also there would also be national statements, but which would be reinforcing, or at least never contradicting, the EU statement. I think this is a bit the point also that you raise. Can you combine the two? Can you have a national independent voice? The Swedish slogan for the seat in the Security Council is a global commitment, independent voice. Can you have an independent voice and at the same time have a one voice of the European Union? I think that's a very good question. And I think this is the discussion we need to have. It shouldn't be a discussion whether it's the EU institutions taking over, but we need a discussion, a collective reflection in the EU. Do we all benefit from speaking with one voice? And this can take many different shapes and forms. It can be one member state speaking on behalf of the EU. Can you combine that with an independent voice? Well, I think it's then you also ask the question: can you eat a cake and have it? Can you have it both ways? I don't think so. I think at some point you have to make a choice. It doesn't mean that you can have, in many instances, individual member states perhaps having a more pronounced view, but fundamentally, I think there is an issue here. But we have to approach it intelligently and have a real reflection about it. And I think we have come to that stage. We have the treaty. We are not going to we are not going to change it. But well, who knows? But anyhow, I think it's more the implementation, the pragmatic discussion that we need to have. Because, as you have raised the question, does the far right influence the EU? Well, I think a bit sometimes. There is a sense that the EU is just there to stay under any conditions, and I think to add to where we started, we in multilateralism we need mutually reinforcement from UN, EU, etc. Because we have this common interest, but we also need it because it can fall apart. Exactly, because the EU is not a solid, it's not a monolith. It is based on these daily negotiations. Yes, we have a treaty, but it is in its core multilateral. And that means that the way member states walk away from this project, it could fall apart. And I think this is sometimes underestimated because everybody, well, not everybody, but sometimes you get the feeling that this organization can take anything, and I don't think it can take anything, as well as the UN can't take anything. It could fall apart. So this is something. It's a very big discussion. ITU, I have to admit, I have to check. I have not particularly come across that body. Perhaps Stefan, but this particular one I can't answer today or tonight. As to the CSDP missions, well, that's also a big question and a very interesting one. I have been on the ground in Kosovo, and in a way, yes, this came in after the UN and is still coexisting with the UN in a quite interesting way. And it maybe is how we started as the European Union, but and as you say, actually we very much as the EU come in support of the UN. Sometimes I think we have felt we can do things quicker than the UN, like this bridging facility in the Central African Republic. But I think, yes, there is probably a strong symbiosis here, and that's why we are more and more seeing how we can cooperate. I think the challenge today, both for us and for UN, are very concrete. It's getting troops on the ground. It's troop generation, force generation, personnel, expertise generation when it comes to civilian missions. It's rapid deployment. So we actually face very similar problems that we need to address, and we can hopefully help each other. But ultimately, again, it's back to the will of our member states to supply the resources to make these decisions a success. Sorry for being lengthy.
Thank you very much. And as an advertisement in a sense, on Thursday, 11 o'clock, there's a public hearing in the European Parliament on CSDP and international organizations, actually. So if you're interested in that, I'm sure it's not too late to set up for that. Can I follow up one small question? Maybe also Stefan can address it, but Jonas, because you mentioned one voice, and of course in your work in Cornwall and you know, in a multilateral division, you're very much at the apex of it. Do you think there are situations where you would also say, don't respond if you can't say it, that the one voice mantra has become an end in itself, and we lose sometimes the sight of what does that one voice actually want to achieve? In other words, you know, we're so obsessed with making sure we have a coordinated role of the member states for good reasons, but then we realize the impact of that coordinated voice actually is not that large and doesn't make a difference. And in worst cases, again, some academics have raised it recently, that this one block, one voice, sometimes it would be better simply let Sweden do its stuff, let the UK do its stuff. So in other words, is the EU maybe still too much in its infancy on doing effective diplomacy in organizations? Is it sometimes too much obsessed with getting this one voice and not focusing too much, losing the side of the ball and trying to score, in other words? Well, what's your view on this?
I think Stefan has an answer to it. I'll come back.
I hope so, yeah. No, and we had many discussions, and let me just start with that one voice question. We had many discussions in New York at the time, internal discussions, in the context of the negotiation of this famous resolution. And I think, and I'm not sure whether this discussion has actually continued then in Brussels-based fora. I don't think so, as far as I follow it, because I think in the end there was a clear view among member states, in fact, that indeed, as a matter of tactics, generally in the UN context, it would not be helpful and good idea to, in any given debate to start distributing roles and to identify, well, okay, the representative of the EU delegation would say this, and then another member state would come in to reinforce the message, and with this distribution of roles. Why? First of all, because I think it was felt this is extremely complicated to organize properly. And then it would actually also risk confusing the membership. And how would you still how could you still ensure a coherent message and a coherent position? And then I think with near unanimity it was felt, no, this is not a good idea. And therefore it's not a mantra, not at all. It's really the result, but again, a New York-based practical reflection in the light of how the UN works, because other groups don't normally do that either. And I think there's quite a good practical difference that I could maybe illustrate. I think when it comes to formal UN debates, the official meetings, formal statements, there indeed it was felt that this should be one voice. So the statements are on behalf of the EU, or its member states, following an internal coordination process. However, what works then quite well, and I think that illustrates my point, I hope, that when it comes in, when a lot of these resolutions are also negotiated in parallel in informal settings, or all the main committees meet informally, and there we have put in place a rather, I think, a well-functioning system of burden sharing, where indeed on specific topics, indeed certain of our member states would take the lead in the Third Committee on Human Rights or on financial matters in the Fifth Committee, etc. And according to specific topics and interest and expertise. And that is actually, on the informal preparatory level, quite a good way of functioning. So I think, and that is how it works in New York, and I don't think there's appetite for member states to change it, and I don't think really that it's not considered as a mantra, and the objective depends on the subject matter. The objective, I think, never gets lost. The objectives are quite clear depending on which policy field you're talking about. I mean, the EU has clear objectives at the UN in matters of human rights. I mean, the negotiations in the Third Committee, the UN there, and the EU there, I think, plays a very active, and that would be one example I think, from of the effectiveness of the EU in projecting and promoting its values, and translating these values in the texts of the relevant resolutions. Indeed, as a more general point, concrete examples. I think again, when you observe what's happening in New York, I think the effective multilateralism happens on a daily basis, basically, in all the committees of the GA, at an ECOSOC, whatever the subject matter. The results are not always very visible. It's nothing that newspapers write about the 10th resolution on the human rights situation in country X. I mean, but the EU's impact is really very much behind the scenes. And touching on the question of the CSDP missions, I think that, to my mind, is an example of success of the EU in, not maybe under the heading effective multilateralism, because the connotation with that is always, in a way, it's as if it was a one-way road. And I think it was mentioned already by some of you or us in the debate that, in fact, it goes both ways, in fact. And I think the fact that now we have more and more situations, as reflected in the relevant UNSC resolutions that refer to an envisaged EU action or requesting the EU to take complementary action, that we didn't have that 5 years ago. And so there is a really growing, I would say, mutual effective multilateralism between the UN and the EU, working together and trying to put their respective means, their different expertises and specializations together in the most effective manner. And that, to my mind, is definitely a success, or one good example of effective multilateralism, if you want to still use this concept, but which has so many facets. But there are a couple of more open questions, which I'm happy to also say something on. But
are there any other questions in your minds? Pressing? Otherwise, I would take you up on the offer of commenting briefly on the COE, the Council of Europe, EU Council of Europe issue. Which might be interesting.
Oh, yeah, that was just an illustration of maybe. Indeed, just to compare with the UN situation, I think at the UN we faced the difficulty of the other blocks, and indeed I think if you look at the language of the resolution, the African group mostly succeeded in putting in the operative part language on, this is actually setting in their view, and they wanted to be a precedent for, when the moment comes that other multilateral, other international organizations are ready, to have organized themselves in a similar manner than the EU, then the General Assembly should also give them a proper role. But yeah, indeed, I mean, that obstacle, that resistance from the UN could be explained indeed by this, other blocks, other groups wanting the same treatment, and therefore they were hesitant in giving it to us. The Council of Europe is different. Is a totally different situation, where the EU status is not entirely clear from a legal institutional point of view, but let's say the EU is generally considered as a full participant there, but the rules of procedure of the COA are not very clear on that. There we face another issue, and that's quite a tricky one, because of the EU also risks losing influence as a collectivity of member states for reasons of its internal distribution of competences, and that's not good. For example, when it comes to participation in specific Council of Europe conventions, and we have some recent examples, and we have not really found a good solution with that, where then the Commission has taken the position this is a matter of exclusive EU competence, and therefore the member states should no longer be participants in that given convention. But the problem is when the convention says normally, then whenever a body set up under the convention then meets under the auspices of the Council of Europe, to take some further implementing measures, each contracting party to such convention has one vote. Now, the more EU member states are contracting parties, the more votes we have. And of course, compared to the UN, at the Council of Europe, we have a very strong bloc, 28 member states compared to 46 or 47 total membership, or close to 50. However, if we apply our exclusive competence, then we are down, in fact, to only one vote, because only the EU would remain as a member. And that is an issue that is more of an internal EU problem in a way. I think other Council of Europe members would not be unhappy, but reduced EU influence. Yeah. So that is a rather difficult, other completely different, I think, take on the problems of, effective multilateralism and how to implement it. Yeah.
It's an interesting issue that's also discussed in this proposal now on EU-IMF relations. There have been some studies that say if you have one single seat in the IMF, it's not going to make you more influential. On the contrary, you have reduced voices, you've got reduced arguing points of different member states, and you combine it to one, and it might indeed not actually give the EU a stronger voice. I would say, as a kind of final round, maybe, if I may ask, it's 44 days after Christmas, and we are an academic institution. If you had one wish free to make the EU more effective in international organizations, what would it be? Panelists, of course, not people. Starting with that.
Thanks for the pleasure to what would it be? Well, I mean,
would you prioritize transparency? Would you prioritize accountability? European impact in global organizations?
Well, I mean, because of the crisis, especially in the economic and financial fora, I think the influence and impact of the EU has grown, which may sound weird, but it is like that. So, for example, G20 initiatives, you have these investment packages. In the EU, we have the Juncker package. So, from the economic and financial issues, I would like to see more streamlining, more harmonizing, because that would mean that there is less crisis. And otherwise, we may gain on influence, but I'm not convinced that this is always a good thing. At the same time, there is need for an overhaul. There is need, as I said, because of all these different structures, different procedures and so on, to be more transparent. And we have to elaborate on what was done in the crisis, and both internally and also in the international organizations.
Thank you. Jonas, any specific...
in one way, I would like to see more vision and passion from the leaders of the member states of the European Union to stand up for this project, because, as I say, if that doesn't happen, it could fall apart. On a more modest level, I think it would be good to have perhaps a real reflection, as I said, about external representation, one voice, or whatever you would like to call it. Because just to say a bit more about that, I mean, I think the questions are, do we have a common interest? I mean, otherwise, of course, it's not a goal in itself, but do we have a common interest? Well, then it makes sense that we try to articulate it together. Do we want to be effective in doing that? Well, then we have to act together as well. And do we believe that no one individual sort of can have sufficient impact on the global level? I mean, it's in a way the whole existential question: why does the European Union exist? Well, if we believe that that's the case, and that's having been a national diplomat, I have seen the change in my own country, that indeed no policy decision will be taken, at least not foreign policy decision, without taking into account the EU aspect of it. I mean, this is a shift of paradigm, but again, it has happened without perhaps the full appreciation that there has been this shift of paradigm. So it's not that the one voice is one person speaking on behalf of the European Union. It is how the 28 member states, how are we successful together in whatever shape and form.
Well, and two points maybe. On my wish list would be, I think, maybe further reform of the treaty. And I'm saying that because for more efficient and coherent institutions. And I'm saying that because I think, unfortunately, the member states with the Treaty of Lisbon, had a good idea, a good objective, this unified external representation and more coherence, more consistency. But the way they only went halfway, if at all. This triple hat of the HR, from my perspective, doesn't really work. I mean, it's maybe it works externally. The HR, I think, is doing a great job at the UN, in the Iran negotiations, in the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, and in many other fields where she's really actively traveling. Internally, the picture is a bit different. I think she places under the influence of the current president of the Commission maybe too much emphasis internally on her role as VP. It has to be said she's done a very good job, I think, so far in trying to coordinate better the other commissioners responsible for external relations. But the fact remains that there are still 4 other commissioners, or let's say 3 at least, if you leave enlargement aside, 3 commissioners that are also responsible for external relations. And no one likes to be coordinated. I mean, that's a common saying. And therefore we have a problem. And then the problem linked to that, that's my second point, is that unfortunately, and that's a matter of indeed the member states realizing or not what is actually in their common interest. I mean, Mogherini is a very good person, I think, but still, I think with a bit of distance, you feel that the member states could have appointed someone slightly more experienced and a slightly stronger personality with a stronger vision of indeed the EU's foreign policy. That person has the mandate to conduct the EU's foreign policy. Not an easy task because of indeed national interests. I mean, that question was raised by some of you, but that indeed being as difficult already as it is, I think I would have wished indeed a stronger person there. Although so far, I mean, she's really grown with the job, and she's well respected, I think, and I've seen it, the privilege to see herself in action in Vienna vis-a-vis the 5 permanent Security Council members, and she did a great job. So I mean, hats off to her for that. But still, from a wider perspective, I don't think that the appointment that appointment was necessarily a very visionary one. I believe, for example, I mean, I think the Swedish foreign minister, I think, would have been a candidate as well, or was even a candidate. So anyway, but the system is extremely complicated, and again, since the Treaty of Lisbon, paradoxically, we had problems at the UN where previously it worked fine, but all of a sudden it was big fight to get this resolution. And internally, it's so complicated, and there's so many turf wars, and we're so engaged. I worked in the Council Legal Service for 13 years, and I've never ever seen in my whole career the Council taking the Commission to court. The Council would also always exercise self-restraint, but because the European Commission now also under the Treaty of Lisbon, with all due respect, to the Commission, but they tend to take now also rather extremist positions on EU exclusive competences without actually thinking of the wider impact, and that's rather sad. And that then the member states indeed have the tendency now to renationalize a little bit their policies, and then to take the Commission to court, and unfortunately sometimes they even lose the cases then, and but they have a counter reaction which is also a bit extremist, again totally EU centric, the EU busy with itself, and that anyway that's very a bit frustrating, I must say. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. But there's one I noted on my notes. There's this question about the far right extremism, maybe that you raised, which I don't think that's an issue. Well, first of all, I don't see it as realistic that, in order to translate, let's say, a far right political position on human rights or whatever, democracy, governance, into a position of the EU at the UN, you would have to have first a political process leading to 28 far-right governments in Europe, which among the 28 member states, which I don't see happening. So therefore, I think really this is a problem to be dealt with at national level until now, and has zero impact on what the EU does externally.